So we're up to Omar of Acha Bar Yaakov, which is on Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis. And if you count up from the bottom of the Amud, it's approximately, I would say, 13 lines up. We'll count to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's only 10 lines up from the bottom. Suma Potur Milomar Haggadah. Now, the assumption is that a blind person is obligated in all mitzvos. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is telling you that the exception to that rule, which he has to prove to us, is Haggadah. That there's something in the mitzvah Haggadah that requires re'iyah, requires the capacity for sight. Now, this Gemara that we're learning, at the face of it, has nothing to do with the previous Gemara of Rava, which we covered yesterday, namely that we should not lift up the Zroa, which is Zecher le Pesach. And the reason for that was, if you recall, that the onlooker mistakenly might come to the conclusion that it looks like he's eating Kodshim Bachutz, which is a violation of an Isa Kares of eating Kodshim Bachutz. And Chutz here means Chutz Lazora. And we'll add here footnote number Lamed Beis. On the bottom right, he says that Lo Suchal Lechol Bisharecha Maser Degoncha Siroshcha V'Yitzchecha B'Choros B'Korecha V'Tzonecha. And this is an azhara that enjoins us from eating basar, chatos, and shlomim, and chatos and asham outside of the azor, or in the case of shlomim, outside of Yerushalayim, and he gets malchus for that. So if he would lift the basar and say Pesach shayu avosenu ochlim, and he's lifting off the tavshil, that the zroa, let's say that's zeicha lemigdash, that's zeicha lepesach, it looks like he's saying this is what we ate, and this is what we're going to eat tonight, and it looks like the korban pesach, and he's bringing it outside the azor. And Rava, makes that statement. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with a summa. So we'll see if we can possibly come up with some connection. Siv Hacha, with regard to the mitzvah of Sipi Tzis Mitzrayim, V'Gada T'Lebincha Bayom Ulema Bavur Zeh Asa Hashem Li B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim Uksiv Hasam. In the parsha of Ben Soru Mora, in Kitetze, it says B'neinu Zeh, the same word Zeh, Sorer Umora. So we have now a Gzeira Shava Zeh Zeh, according to Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, to equate a Summa as far as Ben Sorer Mora is concerned with, again, the parent. One of the two parents is a blind person, with the summa of the Gadat Lebincha. And that's going to teach us pratless summa, that the pasuk in Ben Sorer Mora of Zeh, B'neinu Zeh, comes to exclude a summa. And there's no din of Ben Sorer Mora if one of the parents is a summa, because the parent has to be able to see the son and point him and say, B'neinu Zeh. So you need what's called Re'iyah. Afkan, here too, with regard to Bavur Zeh, in the mitzvah of V'Gadat Lebincha, Prat L'Sumin, Zeh means that you need someone who's capable of pointing and seeing to the exclusion of a summa. Now, the question that we want to raise here is, on a Doraisa level, we established that a suma is potter based on this Gzeira Shava. But what about midrabanan? Did the Rabbanan obligate a suma in the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? And a second question we want to ask is, doesn't the mitzvah require kriya to read the Haggadah? It's not just enough to think in his mind the thoughts and the concepts of the Haggadah, but rather he needs to recite the Haggadah. And the rule of thumb is that whenever you have a mitzvah of kriya, a suma is potter. For example, we have a mitzvah of kriyas haTorah. And if we assume that every individual is obligated in kriyas haTorah, the exception is going to be a suma because he doesn't have the capacity for kriya. He doesn't have nebuch eyesight. Now, I'm tempted to think that this Gemara is predicated on the assumption that you don't need kriya for the mitzvah of Haggadah. That you can be yotzei the mitzvah just with machshava alone, with thought, which would mean that a suma should be included in the mitzvah, if not for the word zeh and the Gzeira Shava to ben Sorah Mora. However, it's a bit strange to say that we derive Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim from Vigada to Lebincha, and we don't require kriya, and it's enough to fulfill this mitzvah b'machshava. But then again, you might ask me a different question. Let's say he has no ben. Would he be exempt or in violation, shall we say, non-fulfillment of the mitzvah vigadata? Or is the Torah saying vigadata lebincha, if you have a ben, and that would be an ideal way of fulfilling the mitzvah, but there's a fallback position, which is Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim even without a ben, and that might be b'machshava, which would include a suma, if not for zeh. What I find here astounding about this Gemara is to derive conclusions about Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim from Ben Sorah Mora, when it doesn't seem, at the face of it at least, to be any connection whatsoever between the requirements for the din of Ben Sorah Mora and the requirements for the mitzvah of the Vigada to Lebincha. In fact, Ben Sorah Mora is not even a mitzvah at all. It's a din that, in certain cases, a person has to be put to death, but there's no mitzvah here involved. The various conditions that have to be met in order to be for a din of a capital punishment for Ben Sorah Mora, there are a host of different requirements. We would not assume that those requirements should have any universal application in other mitzvahs. For example, a Ben Sorah Mora will only be chayev in that first 3-month period after he becomes a gadol. He has what's called simanim, and that's it. 3-month period. I mean, the laws of Ben Sorah Mora are very unique. And one Gemara seems to imply that lo hayv lo nivra, there'll never even be a Ben Sorah Mora. But in any event, these are conditions that the Torah puts forward in order to implement a condemnation for the death penalty, because the Ben Sorah Mora is chayv skila. It's a little bit odd that the Torah would teach us from Ben Sorah Mora to Vigada to Lebincha. But on a mechanical level, we say that that's what Gzeira Shava is all about. The Gzeira Shava equates things that don't seem to be the same because of the Gzeira Shava, and we derive certain dinim. And I'll tell you the truth, I'm tempted to think that this is not really a classic Gzeira Shava. Although I have to admit that if you take a look at the Rashbam, Dibra Maskil Ba'avur, he says, V'Rav Sheshes V'Rav Yosef Gzeira Shava Lo Gamo. So we're going to see later on the dissenting views of Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef, who are going to reject Rav Hacha Bar Yaakov. But why do they do so? Because they didn't have the Gzeira Shava. The Gzeira Shava is something that you have to have the Kabbalah that was transmitted from one generation to the other. They didn't have the Kabbalah of the Gzeira Shava. But obviously, the Rashbam is telling us that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov himself had a Gzeira Shava. But if not for the Rashbam, we could have said the following, that even if you don't have a Gzeira Shava, you can still derive interpretations of a word in the Torah from one parsha to the other. So how do we interpret the word zeh? And zeh means to point b're'iyah. And that we see in Ben Soramor, because the word zeh in B'nai Zeh excluded a parent who was blind. So if we could derive from Ben Soramor the Taich, the interpretation of the word zeh, now we could plug it in and apply it to Bavur Zeh in the case of Sipitis Mitzrayim. So that's another perspective on this sugya of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. He's not basing himself on a comparison between two parshios and two dinim, one of which has to do with condemning a Ben Soramor for death, and the other that has to do with the mitzvah of Sipur, but rather he's borrowing from Ben Soramor the interpretation of the word Zeh. But of course, again, you might argue that the word Zeh appears in many different places in the Torah. And we could probably derive from many different places that the word Zeh means to point to something that you see. Like, for example, Zeh Kelim Yamveu, and Chazal say that the Shivchal Hayam was able to point to the Shechina, so to speak. Now, in footnote number Lamed Gimel, he gives you a little bit of an overview of the laws of Ben Soramor. I don't think that we have to go through all of these dinim, but the point here of this parsha is that we exclude from Ben Soramor a case of a blind parent. And the parents play a major role in Ben Soramor. They have to bring the son to Bezdin and accuse their son explicitly of the violations of Zol V'Sova. He stole from his parents, and he bought meat and wine, and he drank and he ate, and so forth and so on. All this is from the parents. And the parents have to be able to see their son and point to him. And the word B'neinu is in plural because it refers to both parents. Now he quotes a Gemara here in footnote number Lamed Hey in Bava Kama Pei Zayin, and Rabbi Yehuda says that Suma is Potter Mikol HaMitzvos. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is deriving from the word Zeh a specific exemption in the case of Sipitis Mitzrayim, apparently never accepting Rabbi Yehuda, but rather accepting Rabbi Meir, who argues against Rabbi Yehuda and says that a suma is chayav in all mitzvahs. But here, he quotes the Mordechai, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz. The Mordechai says that Rav Acha holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and a suma is potem in a mitzvahs. But on a Drabanan level, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the Rabbanan imposed a chiyuv mitzvahs on the suma. So Midaraisa is poter, Mirabbanan is chayav, and therefore he should certainly be chayav in the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. But from the pasuk, Bavur Zeh, he derives that a suma is poter from Agada, even Midrabanan, which is a pella when you think about it. The Torah says Zeh. What does that have to do with the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan wanted to include a suma in mitzvahs. So rabbinically, they obligated him in mitzvahs, even though on a deraisa level he's potter. We're going to Rabbi Yehuda. But who says that because it says Zeh in the pasuk, therefore the Rabbanan are going to exempt a suma when he's chayiv in all mitzvahs? You follow what I'm saying? We're going from a deraisa, a pasuk, to a Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, according to the Mordechai, reflecting the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, are very much aware of the fact that the Torah exempted a suma, but nevertheless they imposed the chiyuv midrabanan on the suma. Otherwise, the suma is like a guy, so to speak. He's outside of all the mitzvahs. So they were obligated the suma midrabanan in mitzvahs, and now that principle of a chiyuv midrabanan should apply to Haggadah, to be mechayiv the suma in the midst of sipur midrabanan. But no, it says the word zeh. Okay, that's on a deraisa level, but on a drabanan level, despite the p'tur, the Rabbanan imposed and instituted a chiyuv on the suma. Why shouldn't that apply to the mitzvah of igada to lebincha? So I think the mechanism is the following. When the Torah gives a general rule, the Rabbanan could change that rule on a Rabbanan level. And if the Torah says that a suma is poter mikol mitzvahs, the Rabbanan could say he's chayav in kol mitzvahs, and they have the authority to do so. But when the Torah takes a particular mitzvah and singles it out and says that there's a p'tur in that mitzvah, then the Rabbanan's hands are tied. They cannot contradict the Torah and create a chiyuv in a specific mitzvah which the Torah exempted from. When the Torah goes out of its way to exempt someone from a mitzvah, a particular mitzvah, so like, for example, if the Torah says that women are exempt from mitzvah seishes man groma, the Rabbanan could establish that in certain cases they're chayav. But if the Torah exempts a woman from a specific mitzvah, or in our case, the Torah exempts the suma from the mitzvah of sipur in a very specific way, then that's a mandate to the Rabbanan that this person is not only poter from the mitzvah, he's mufka. You cannot impose, even on the Rabbanan level, that chiyuv mitzvah. That's what it comes out according to the Mordechai. Without the Mordechai, we would assume that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Meir, who says that a suma in general is chayav in mitzvahs, and the exception to that rule is going to be Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Would there be a chiyuv d'Rabbanan? I don't know. We can waver back and forth on that. And now the Gemara asks the kasha from Rav Yosef. Eini, is this really so that a suma is exempt from Haggadah? Omar Meremar Shaltinu l'Rabbanan de Bei Rav Yosef. In the base medrash of Rav Yosef, the Rabbanan that were part of that school of the base medrash of Rav Yosef were asked the following question: Man di Omar Agadita Bei Rav Yosef, who would read the Haggadah in the house of Rav Yosef. The Talmidim in the Beis Medrash, they knew, they had shimush, they knew what their Rebbe Rav Yosef did. What did he do on the night of the Seder? Would it be that somebody would read the Haggadah, and that would be no doubt Rav Yosef himself on behalf of the people at the table of Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef himself was blind. Amru, so in response to the question that apparently Merema raised amongst the Chachamim in the Beis Medrash of Rav Yosef, the answer that was given was to Merema, Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef himself read the Haggadah on behalf of the entire household. Now, we have a principle that a bar chiyuva can be motzi acheret. But if you're not a bar chiyuva, you cannot be motzi acheret. And Rav Yosef, presumably, based on Rav Acha bar Yaakov's principle, is a summa is potem in a mitzvah. He's not a bar chiyuva. He cannot be motzi others yidei chavasa. His man the Omar got it to Beirav Sheshes. Meremar then went over to the Beis Medrash of Rav Sheshes, and he asked the same question. Rav Sheshes was also blind. Who recited the Haggadah at the table of Rav Sheshes? Amrulo Rav Sheshes. Now, in both these cases, whether it's Rav Yosef who was blind or Rav Sheshes who was blind, apparently they held that a summa is chayav in the mitzvah Haggadah. We don't know what to do with the word zeh, but otherwise, if they were not chayav, if you accept the drush of zeh as Rav Acha bar Yaakov has it, then they could not be motzi acherim yidei chovasim in Haggadah because they were part of the mitzvah of Haggadah. And the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah establishes Kol she'eino mechuyev b'davar eino motzi es harabim yidei chovasa. I mean, the fact that Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes read the Haggadah for themselves, if they had done so, that's not a question. They may be potter, but they decided that, reading the Haggadah is no worse than Talmud Torah. There's no prohibition that asers a suva from reading the Haggadah if he wants to be machmir on himself. But the fact that they were motzi acherim, that must mean that they understood that they have a chiyuv. Without that chiyuv, they couldn't be reading the Haggadah on behalf of anyone else. Now, here we have apparently a question that's raised by the Mefarshim. Why do you need the proof from the fact that they, meaning Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, recited the Haggadah on behalf of the members of the household? Why not just derive that conclusion that they held they were chai from the brachas themselves? For example, the bracha at the end of Magid that we spent a lot of time on here in this Mishnah, Asher Golanu Golasavosenu, that bracha starts with the Shem Hashem. And how could they voluntarily, if they're not chayav, read that bracha? Can I decide that I'm going to thank Hashem for thunder and lightning if there is no thunder and lightning? So when you have an obligation to thank Hashem and express your Shevach Hodoyah, that justifies a bracha. But there's no such thing as an optional bracha. So we have a shita of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam, well, let me introduce Rabbeinu Tam with the famous question. Can a woman recite a bracha on a mitzvah saseshes man groma. When she's exempt from a time-bound mitzvah, can she volunteer to do the mitzvah and make a bracha on it? Asher kidshanim mitzvosav v'tzivonu. The Rambam, for example, and many, many other Rishonim say no, she can't say Asher kidshanim mitzvosav v'tzivonu. She's not obligated in that mitzvah. So she hears the shofar blowing, and it's optional. You can't say Asher kidshanim mitzvosav v'tzivonu. Or, for example, on a sukkah, on the lulav, but Rabbeinu Tam disagrees. He allows a woman to recite a bracha even when she's not obligated. So it could be that Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef recited the brachas of the Haggadah without an obligation because of the sheet of Rabbeinu Tam. Again, they didn't know about Rabbeinu Tam, but based on the logic and the ruling that underlies the sheet of Rabbeinu Tam, that a person who opts for a mitzvah voluntarily can recite a bracha, which is a pella when you think about it. How can you say Asher Kisharim Mitzvos V'tzivanu when you were not commanded in the mitzvah, but maybe it means V'tzivanu in general, that other members of the community of Israel are obligated. So it could very well be, as we said before, that Rav Sheshes and Rav Yehuda recited the Haggadah for themselves as an option, as a voluntary mitzvah, and you can make a bracha on a voluntary mitzvah like Rabbeinu Tam. But from the fact that they were motzi acherim and they recited the Haggadah on behalf of the household, and we have a principle, kol she'ena mechuyev b'davar, ena motzi acherim yidei chovasam, then how could they do that unless they were of the opinion that assume is chayev in the mitzvah of Haggadah? Now, we have a problem here when we learn this sugya with the tshuva from the Maram al-Shakar, which you'll see quoted here at the very end of note number Lamed Tes, or if you're counting from the bottom of the page on the left column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up. And in this tshuva, the Maram says that Sibei Tzias Mitzrayim requires Haggadah b'peh, not the way we said it, that it's enough, at least on a fallback position, but the Eved, to be Yotzi with Machshava, you need peh, Haggadah b'peh. So what does Vaygadet Olabincha mean? Haggadah b'peh. Now, if you need Haggadah b'peh, ein yotzim bo b'shmiya mipi acher. We have to underline those words. Ein yotzim bo b'shmiya mipi acher. I mean, how do you reconcile that with our Gemara? I mean, the whole premise of our sugya is that the members of the household were yotzei by hearing Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes. I know it seems to me that the only way of explaining this is to assume against Rabbeinu Tam that because Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes recited the Haggadah for themselves, and included in that recitation were brachos with Shemu Malchus, that would not lend itself to some sort of voluntary recitation. You can't volunteer to recite a bracha, again, leaving out Rabbeinu Tam, if you're not obligated. That means that they were obligated. Let's go on. Kasavri Rabbanon. We're talking about Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes. Matzah b'zman hazeh d'Rabbanon. The matzah, like the Korban Pesach, requires the Beis Hamikdash. So b'zman hazeh, we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, we don't have the Korban Pesach, we don't have matzah. And the entire entity of eating matzah in our time after the Churban is the Rabbanon. So the Gemara seems to be assuming that the issue of Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim and whether you're chayiv or not depends upon matzah. Meaning that if there's no mitzvah of matzah bisman hazeh, then if so facto, there's no mitzvah of Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim bisman hazeh, and the whole entity of Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim bisman hazeh, like matzah, bisman hazeh, is only the Rabbanon. And the Rabbanon obligated the Summa. So you're asking me, how could the Summa be motzi the members of the household Yidei Chovasam? Well, they're only chayiv midrabanan, and the Summa is only chayiv midrabanan. Of course, on a Derais 11 bavur zeh, and a bar chiyuva derabanan can be motzi a bar chiyuva derabanan. So it means that according to Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, despite the fact that we, after the Churban, are exempt from the mitzvahs of matzah and Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim, nevertheless, the Rabbanan obligated us in those two mitzvahs. All right. Now, what's the basis for the Gemara's premise that Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim depends upon matzah? Meaning that if matzah bisman hazeh is the Rabbanon, then ipso facto Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim is the Rabbanon. And we can only postulate that Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim is doraisa if matzah were doraisa. So that's the subject here of footnote number Mem Aleph that starts on the last line of page Gimel here and goes on to page Dalet. And he quotes the Mechilta. V'yigadet bincha bayomahu lemor, ba'avur ze'as Hashem li b'tzeisi mitzrayim, b'shah sheyesh matzah u'morar munachim lefanecha al shulchanecha. The mitzvah of v'yigadet bincha depends upon matzah munach al shulchanecha. Now, I don't know if that means literally he has to have the matzah on the table. I don't think so, but it means it has to have a mitzvah of matzah. If there's no mitzvah of matzah, then there's no mitzvah of igadat lebincha. And this is all derived from the same bavur zeh from which we wanted to derive the p'tur of suma. Harei shetola kosav mitzvahs hagodah b'matzah u'morar. Who had in Sipitis Mitzrayim D'Rabbanan. So he quotes this in the name of Rabbi Yerucham parallel. And now he quotes the Dvar Shmuel, the Ode, Al Pi Amavur Li El Daf Lamed Vav, Shamatza Nikres Lechem Oni, Mishum sha'onim oleh dvarim harbe. And Rashi explains sha'omrim oleh ha'halil va'agodah. So if you recall, we learned the Harei Kedem in the name of Soloveitchik that there are two elements in the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim. There's the Sipur B'Peh, and then there's the Achila. So, for example, we take the matzah, and when we eat the matzah, we describe the matzah, Alma, right? Yotzu Avasenu B'Chipazon, Rabbi Tarfon. So, through that Achila of matzah, we fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim. If he introduced the matzah with the description of the matzah. So that means that the full-fledged mitzvah of Sipur requires the achil of matzah, presumably the achil of matzah, which is obligatory. So he cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim in its full form without eating the matzah. So what we're saying is that part of the mitzvah of Sipur is the achil of matzah. He says it a little differently, based on the Rashi of Lechem Oni, that part of the mitzvah of matzah is Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim, right? Lechem she'oni she'onim olav dvarim harbe. So when we look at the mitzvah of matzah, we know that the mitzvah of matzah depends upon Sipur. But I think the way we said it is a little bit better. That the mitzvah of Sipur depends upon the matzah. Because the full-fledged kiyum of the mitzvah of Sipur requires the achil of matzah. So when it says lechem she'onim olav dvarim harbe, that's establishing an interdependence between Sipur and matzah, meaning that you cannot fulfill Sipur without the matzah. The matzah has to be a lechem she'onim olav dvarim harbe. But if matzah bisman is the Rabbanon, then Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim is also the Rabbanon. And Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim as a mitzvah d'oraisa is contingent upon the matzah. If there is matzah, there's Sipur. If there's no matzah, there's no Sipur. So Memela, let's just review. The Gemara is now arguing that Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes could be motzi the acherim yedei chovasam in Sipur, even though Asum is potur, and we're accepting Rav Acha bar Yaakov bavur zeh. But the reason why he could be motzi them is because they're not chayv d'oraisa; they're only chayv d'rabbanan. Why are they only chayv in Sipur d'rabbanan? Because there's no matzah bisman hazeh. So on a doraisa level, they're not chayiv in sipur because they're not chayiv in matzah, but the Rabbanan instituted a chiyuv d'Rabbanan on a suma to fulfill the mitzvah of sipur yitzis Mitzrayim. And now, if a suma is obligated in Rabbanan in sipur yitzis Mitzrayim, he can be motzi acherim who are likewise only chayav in sipur midrabanan because there is no matzah bisman hazeh, and sipur depends upon matzah. So this you'll see spelled out in Membeis. He writes, "Kevan shematzah bisman hazeh midrabanan, his chadish al asuma chiyuv midrabanan." So now the suma shares the same level of chiyuv as everybody else. In the achil of matzah, he's chayiv in achil's matzah d'Rabbanan, and therefore he's going to be chayiv in Rabbanan in sipur yitzis Mitzrayim. V'lachein yachol hu lahotzi acherim b'chiyuv zeh. Everybody is equal; they all have a chiyuv d'Rabbanan. Had it been a chiyuv d'oraisa, then the sum would be patur. And that would be based on Bavur Zeh. And it could be even on a D'Rabbanan level, he's not Chayiv. So this is the presentation of the Rashbam in the Sugya. I'm trying to figure out if you can help me. What about the principle of trade d'Rabbanan? Right, you may remember that we discussed in Birkas Hamazon, if let's say you eat bread to the tune of a kizayis, you're only chayiv in Birkas Hamazon d'Rabbanan and not d'Oraisa. Now a katan, l'chora, who's chayiv in Rabbanan, he can be motzi you in Birkas Hamazon. But Tosfos rejects this based on the principle of trade d'Rabbanan. The katan is a double d'Rabbanan. With regard to Birkas Hamazon, he's d'Rabbanan, and on top to boot, he's a katan, and therefore he's only chayiv in Rabbanan. So you have trade d'Rabbanan, two d'Rabbanans, one piled on top of the other. And trade d'Rabbanan cannot be motzi chad d'Rabbanan. Here in the case of Suma, l'chora, I would say we have a case of trade d'Rabbanan. Everybody's only chayav in sipur yitzis Mitzrayim, but he has a separate reason why he's only chayav d'Rabbanan because of Bavur Zeh. So I think what we want to say is the following, that if a person ate a kizayis, the Rabbanan instituted a chiyuv d'Rabbanan of Birkas Hamazon, but they didn't include katan. Katan is potter for a different reason entirely. So anyone who could be chayav in Birkas Hamazon d'Oraisa, if he ate kidei svir, let's say he ate kibbetza, the Rabbanan formulated and established a chiyuv d'Rabbanan if he ate a kizayis. But when it comes to a katan, he's potter because he's a katan. Now you may want to impose a chiyuv on him called chinuch d'Rabbanan, but that's a separate category, a separate machayev. It's not that the Birkas Hamazon was established to create an obligation in the case of a kizayis, even on a katan. That wasn't included in the takana, because the katan has a totally separate reason why he's potter. You're potter because you only ate a kizayis. He's potter because even had he eaten a kibbetza, he'd still be potter. He's potter because of mitzvahs. But in the case of matzah, and for that matter, Sipri Tzis Mitzrayim, which is dependent upon matzah, the Torah exempted because we don't have a Korban Pesach. And the Rabbanan decided to establish a chiyuv min Rabbanan to eat matzah and to recite Sipri Tzis Mitzrayim. When they did so, they included the suma. I don't understand it. Why would they include a suma? A suma is potter because included a suma. No, I don't have it. I thought I had it. L'chora, this should be a case of trade d'Rabbanan. The suma should be potter for two reasons. Number one, because everyone's potter, because matzah bisman is d'Rabbanan. And number two, he's potter because he's a suma. And he's not included in Bavur Zeh. So he has two strikes against him, so to speak. He's a trade d'Rabbanan. He's got the general d'Rabbanan that applies to everyone. Of course, matzah bisman is d'Rabbanan. And he has his own d'Rabbanan because he's a suma. So it's exactly the same as the case of katan that I mentioned before. I don't know. I really got stuck here. Gentlemen, you want to help me at all? I mean, it's very quiet out there today. I call it the Zoom quiet. Z.
It's a good Shiloh. I have no answer.
Yeah. Oh, I see something here in brackets that might shed a light. Let's see. You know, Membeis here is a very long note. And the major paragraph is the second paragraph. It starts with the words achatosvis. And if you count down 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in that paragraph that starts achatosvis, he has brackets. Do you see those brackets? The afshechiv hasuma who trade rabbanon. B'shar b'nei adam chayev chad rabbanon. Yochal hasuma lahotzi kol adam. I mean, he asks the question, at least, but I don't know how he answers it. The afshechiv hasuma who trade rabbanon. B'shar adam who chad rabbanon. Yochal hasuma lahotzi kol adam. Why? He tells you that the answer lies in Tosas Megillah. So I'm going to make myself a note here. I have a busy day today because of Erev Lag BaOmer. I don't want to count the Sphira yet. Just kidding. But if I get a chance, or if anybody wants to voluntarily do this work, because it shouldn't all have to fall on my shoulders. He quotes a Tosas b'Megillah Yud Tesam it pays. Divra Maschel v'Rebbe. And another Tosas, apparently also Megillah, Chav Daled Omen Aleph, Divra Maschel Mi. So I don't know. There are two different Tosas in here that he quotes. So we'll see if we can research that. So Bosai, I'm on my way now to another part of Efrat. I won't make it on time for 10 o'clock. It's at least a 15-minute drive, I think. I don't know, I'll time it. So then we're going to learn Sukkah, Perek Lulav HaGazol. If you want to join me, that would be great. Okay then? Thank you so much.